My name is Paul G. Summers, and I'm in Memphis, Tennessee today, June the 10th, 1998, to interview S. Shepard Tate. This interview is taking place as part of the legal history project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Good morning, Shep.
Good morning, Paul.
I'm going to cover three topics today, Shep, and I appreciate your allowing me to call you Shep.
I hope you will.
We're going to cover your background, your family background, some of your legal background, but then the second topic will be primarily focused on your career as a lawyer.
Okay.
And then the third segment of our interview this morning will be on community activities and career overview.
Okay.
We're going to take a break.
Okay.
When we get tired, we're going to be relaxed, and we're going to have a good time.
Good. Looking forward to it.
Because we want to learn about Stonewall Shepard Tate. Age, how old?
80.
80 years old. Born when?
December 1917, Memphis, Tennessee.
Tell us about your name. That's a pretty interesting name.
Well, it's an interesting background because, as we recall from reading it, the war between the states, the Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression, or the War of Unhappy Remembrance, as the South Carolinians often called it, they had a big naval battle right outside this building down the Mississippi, and it was a battle of the ironclads. And they thought that the Southern forces would win real quick, and the write-ups say the women even went out in all their finery to watch it. Well, the result was the Northern ironclads defeated the Southerners. And I remember handling an estate where there was in the lockbox the demand from the federal gunboat commander. He said, I demand the surrender of the city. It was to a Mayor Park, P-A-R-K, and in that the lockbox also was kind of a little carbon copy where he said, with my diminished force, there's nothing I can do other than turn it over to you. They put the Confederate soldiers in what we call now a POW camp, and my grandfather had two older sisters, Auntie and Aunt Sam, and they went out with my grandfather in a hack one day to take some quinine and food to the Confederates in this POW camp, and this Yankee sentry looked at their passes and said, what about his pass? And said, well, goodness, he just doesn't have a pass, he's just 5 years old. Said, well, what is his name? He stood up in the hack, his name was David, and without the advice or help of a lawyer, he said, my name is Stonewall Jackson Shepard. And he changed his name right then and there. And so I got that name, Stonewall Shepard. My first cousin was Stonewall Shepard. And the funny thing is, everyone called him Stony Shepard, and yet he didn't want me to use the name. And many times on a high school diploma and so forth, he'd have me leave it off. In college, leave it off. The only place in the military, it'd be Stonewall, middle initial S, Tate. And that's how I got that name, and it really was an impact on him too that time, because right after that, his father, my great-grandfather, came downtown. They lived over on Pontotoc right at auction to get something from a store, and they found him murdered with a Yankee hat by his head. Next day, a pawnbroker came to my great-grandmother and said, here's Mr. Shepard's gold watch that a Yankee soldier pawned this morning. I thought you'd want it. It's one of those watches, Paul, that you press the button and the back popped open. Sure. And it said, given to Joseph Henry Shepard by Morgan and Company, where he had been employed up in Nashville, April 1840, as I recall, and I've still got that watch.
And this was your great-grandfather?
Great-grandfather, who was murdered by this Yankee. And he then had been a business merchant as Shepard and Moore. Later became William R. Moore. And later, my grandfather, Mr. Stonewall Jackson Shepard, was Chancellor of the Episcopal Diocese of Tennessee, and Bishop Thomas Gaylor wrote him a letter and said, I remember being in Memphis one time, and I looked out on the street from the hotel, and there was a man prone on the street, and there was a little boy standing over him, and grandfather wrote back and said, that was my father, and I was that little boy. And that's great. And I learned something else at that time. They tell me that they didn't have buy-sell agreements, and I always heard that my great-grandmother said that Mr. Moore was not very kindly on giving her the money she thought she needed and so forth. And they said she sold the property that later became the First National Bank in order to send my grandfather to the University of Virginia to college.
Tell us about your parents. I know from your resume that you, of course, have roots here in Memphis, but you also have some roots in North Mississippi. Tell us about your parents.
My great-grandfather, I don't want to be sounding, not be modest, apparently he was a large owner of property down there, and they maybe called him a planter, I don't know, instead of a farmer. His name was Thomas Simpson Tate, and he lived in Senatobia, and we've got this big old book, Tate County, and they named that county after him, Tate County. And then his son was Simpson Tate, that was my grandfather, and then my father's name was Simpson Tate, and my brother's name was Simpson Tate, so they just perpetuated, I guess, that name. And so Daddy was always down on the plantation. He'd leave early in the morning. We lived in Midtown here in Memphis, and he'd leave at about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning on Monday morning and go down there and be the whole week down there and come up on Saturday afternoon. We always greeted him with great love because he always brought out of the commissary a great big sack. He always brought us 2 candy bars, maybe 2 Milky Ways or Hershey bars, and 2 packages of gum. And then he'd usually go to the ball game. Many times he'd take us to
How far was Tate County from Memphis?
Well, Tunica, Hollywood is where he had his place. When his daddy died, Daddy had 2 sisters, Eugenia Tate Carter. Her husband was Mr. M.O. Carter, CPA, and then Connie Tate Smithwick. He was in the cotton business, and Daddy ran the place until they later divided it up, but it was all at Hollywood and Clacks and Robinsonville. And Hollywood, where all the casinos are now, is about 40 miles from Memphis, about an hour's drive, but then you had to go on gravel roads, you know, to get down there.
What was your mother doing all this time when your father was down on working on the plantation?
Well, I think Mother was taking care of us. I have an older brother, Simpson, and then I have a sister, Carolyn, whom they call Sugar, and they well named her. And then I have 2 younger brothers, Granville, who was in the military and is retired, and another brother, Gordon, who is deceased. So she was taking care of us and getting us to school and taking us to church. She was always insistent, and I'm glad she was, to get us to Sunday school and church on Sunday, and all during Lent. We Episcopalians, we went to every one of the Lenten services and got the little gold crosses or medals or bookmarks because we had had perfect attendance. She'd take us to that all during Lent. So she was taking care of us that whole time while Daddy was down there on the place.
Your father died when you were young.
Yeah, what happened was when the Depression came on, I remember this vividly because he told me, he said, son, cotton is costing me 12 cents a pound to raise, and I'm getting a nickel for it. My brother and I went to private schools. They took us out. My sister had been in a private school, and so they all moved down to Mississippi on the place there. And the plan was I'd stay up here 1 year with my grandparents and my grandfather, Mr. Stonewall Jackson Shepherd. He was the senior vice president, general counsel, and senior trust officer of Bank of Commerce, which later became National Bank of Commerce. And the theory was I was going to stay up here 1 year, but that never happened, and I stayed up here the whole time, and they were down there in Mississippi at Hollywood. And I'd go down on weekends and be with them that way. Oh, what Mother did, Daddy had a miserable cancer. I never saw anything like it. He never had really been sick. He was about 6'3", a great physical specimen. And he died, and then Mama went to work. She had never done anything. In fact, her sister used to say she thought one cow gave milk and another cow gave cream. She didn't know anything about it. She had made her debut and all that stuff. And so she needed to get a job, so she went to school and learned typing and shorthand, and she knew Governor Hugh White, who was the governor of Mississippi, and he gave her a job as the Tunica County welfare agent. And what she did was to go out and see all these people who needed help through welfare, and she would assess their needs and get the money for them and see that that was taken care of. And then she learned to garden, and she had a tremendous garden. Used to always say, everything on the plate here tonight is something I've raised in my garden. And the farm was heavily mortgaged, and the insurance company said, all we want you to do is pay the taxes, otherwise we'd have to take the place. And she worked and worked until that was all paid off, and then she enjoyed herself by traveling many parts of the world afterwards.
We're gonna skip ahead
Okay.
very briefly, and so we can get some background, but then we're gonna go back to your childhood.
Right.
You're married, of course, to Janet. I believe you call her Jan.
Jan, right.
And you were married when?
Boy, that's a hard question. Where's that note real quick? I was married on,
I knew I put you on the
this is
spot
where I
with
want to make a correction if I get that wrong. I knew that. I was February 8, 1946
All right.
in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Okay. And you have 3 children.
3 children, right.
Tell us about them.
Adele is the oldest, and she is just a lovely, wonderful girl. She went through school, and when she got, try to shortcut this, she got in about the 11th grade and had some emotional problems and so forth. She was in the scholastic group and played tennis and so forth, and she ended up going to 2 of the finest mental institutions in the country. One Shepherd Pratt and another in Austin Riggs, and nobody knew really what the problem was, that she just couldn't seem to get things done. And then they called me one time when I was coming back from Chicago from the American Bar Association and said she'd gone blind. And so we brought her back home here, and they performed this operation on her. They thought that she had a brain tumor, and she did have a brain tumor, and it was a successful operation. She had to have a battery of operations because her eye was down and the muscles were off, and they had to take off part of the skull to get it all done. And so it took a good time for her to get her sight back and to get back in shape. And so she's a lovely girl, but she's now about 50 and just enjoying life, but she went through that horrible experience. The next was Shep, who is, Jan says, you don't talk about your children, but he's a very fine person, an able lawyer, and great guy, and civically minded, and he was with us in the firm. I've been in practice 50 years. He was in practice for 20 years with us, but recently, I guess 8 months ago, he opened up his own firm because he has this specialty of security litigation, and he does work for the New York Stock Exchange in arbitration and the National Association of Security Deals. So he does that. And then little Jan, who's the youngest, she went to Vanderbilt as Shep did. Shep got his law degree and his undergraduate. And then she had a godfather who said that she should go up to Washington to get a job. She got a job with Howard Bacon for about, I think, 8.5 years with his legislative liaison after she learned what it was all about. And then she worked with him when he went up to New Hampshire, you know, when he ran for president. Then, when he was out of the Senate, she went as a legislative liaison for a new guy named Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, and then worked with him. And then after that, she went over to the White House to be on the transition team with Bush and Quayle. And then finally, she thought she ought to get back with her husband and 2 kids, even though they had a wonderful little nanny. And so now she's back, and they do a great deal of church work and the like, and she's very active in a church. And her husband is a civil engineer, but he's been doing more church work than other things now.
Tell us about your wife.
When I got ready to go up to Cincinnati, Judge Frank Hoyt Gaylor on the Supreme Court had a sister, a maiden sister, and they were children of the bishop. And she came over and said, "Shepherd, I want you to call on Janet when you get up there, because she and Mary Ann, my niece, were roommates at Vassar." So dutifully as we were in those days, and she said I called on her the last minute, the last day. That wasn't true. But anyway, that's where we met, and I was a law clerk at that time for Judge John D. Martin, a member of the U.S. Court of Appeals for 6th Judicial Circuit. So I met Jan, and then we got married here, and I started a law practice about that time, and she was always very helpful. And I remember I started off with $1,500 in a red Chevrolet, and I had paid in advance $55 a month in rent for a little garage apartment. And Jan would always console me about my finances. I had a good deal. I was with John Martin Jr., the judge's son, after I finished my clerkship, and I had $200 a month with 10% of the net, which I did well. But I would worry about these things, and Jan would always console me. And one night I said, on a little pillow talk, I said, "Honey, if I should lose everything I have, would you still love me?" And she said, "Yes, but I'd miss you." And the law practice was good. And so we've been married now for over 50 years.
Let's go back to your childhood.
Uh-huh.
Tell us about grade school, where you went, what type of school it was, teachers, classes,
Right.
things of this nature.
And in those days, there was a private school as opposed to a public school called Pentecost Garrison. It was Mrs. Althea Pentecost and Miss B. Garrison. And it was over there just on Idlewild, on the west side of Idlewild, just in the
Here
block
in
north of Union in Memphis. And it had the 9 grades, and I went there. And Simpson, my older brother, went there. And I got through, I think, about the 6th grade, I believe it was, and then that's when we were pulled out because of the Depression. And enjoyed the school and had a lot of fun and worked hard and made a lot of friends that I still have during my years now.
And then Bellevue High School,
Then
junior
I went to Bellevue, and they put me up a half a grade, and then that summer I did some work, and they put me up another half, so I stayed there.
Well, you're kind of being modest. Truth is, you skipped a grade, didn't you?
Well, I mean, that's what it amounted to, I guess. And then I went over to Central High, which was right about a block away, which was an excellent, excellent school. And I was there and was graduated in 1935, and this next week or two, on the 21st, we're going to have a group of the Central High. We have it every year of the grads, so that's from 35 to 1998. That's a number of years, 63 years that we've been meeting nearly every year after the war.
Did you have any particular hobbies or recreational activities when you were growing up through high school that you'd like to share with us?
One thing, there are 2 things. One, scouting was the thing that I was so interested in. I just couldn't get into scouting soon enough. In fact, you start as age 12, and I started almost at age 11. I was so interested in it, and it meant so much to me. And then I went to Camp Kykema over in Hardy, Arkansas a couple of summers, and then I was fortunate to become a very young Eagle Scout at 13, and I've kept active in scouting. So I did that. And then also, with the Depression, I learned something about money, and I had all sorts of jobs. And my wife said, when I talk about I had a paper out for the press cemetery, Memphis Press Cemetery, and the motto was "On Porch, on Time," she said, the way I talk about it, I must have had it for 10 years. Well, I had it about 9 months, but it was about the best job I ever had because I'd collect the money. The former carrier had quit, so I had to go around. I had it between Central and Peabody and Belvedere and McLean, an area in which we lived. I knew most of the people, so I encouraged them to pay by the month, which was 35 cents a month as opposed to 10 cents every Saturday. But I had 2 people I collect 10 cents and 10 cents, that's 20 cents. So I went to the movie, which was 10 cents, and then I got a Coke for a nickel and popcorn for a nickel, so that's what I did on Saturday afternoons. And then I sold every magazine, I guess, it ever was sold, Ladies' Home Journal, Country Gentleman, Literary Digest, all of them. And then I also sold flour, F-L-O-U-R. I worked one time selling flour, and then one time I worked in a Piggly Wiggly or something grocery store, and that was one of the hardest jobs I ever had. I remember I made deliveries, and someone had packed some coffee cans on some eggs and squashed them and broke them, and I had to pay for the broken eggs. So I learned how careful you had to be. So I had different jobs, and then my grandfather insisted that I learn shorthand and typing. I had to get permission early on in Central to do that, and immodestly I might say I was apparently fairly good because they had a city contest, and they had 2 from each school, and I was one of the 2 from Central that participated. And they'd go around from school to school and put you on the stage, and they'd have you open up a book and you start typing. The first person that threw the cards, they thought that person was winning, you know, like a race, but you might have had a half dozen errors in it. The girl from Central incidentally won it. I didn't. And so he said that when I started practicing law, and he'd gone to the University of Virginia and had been a lawyer, but when he went deaf, he went into banking. And some of my bankers laugh about that. But he said that I needed to have a job so I could do something because I couldn't get any clients, and that's what he thought I should need. So I used that. I worked for 9, 10, 11 summers in the Bank of Commerce, and my mentor there was a fellow named Tom Vinton, who had been very close to my grandfather, who my grandfather had trained him, and then he went ultimately to Union Planters Bank, and I worked there, and I did typing and bookkeeping and general coupon and handling mortgage loans and handling stock transfer. The reason I say that, it was so helpful to me when I got to law school. I knew what a mortgage looked like, a deed of trust, a stock, a coupon, and so forth. But I do have one memory of that. When I first started, I worked on Saturday. Betty Watts, who was my supervisor, would take me in every Saturday into the vault and open up a cigar box and give me out a 50-cent piece. And one time she gave it to me and said, "You really didn't earn it today." So that's what I remember vividly about my experience working.
You went to Rhodes College, which at that time was known as Southwestern at Memphis.
Correct.
How did you choose Southwestern?
Frankly, you know, I never had any thought of what I would do in life, except I was just told, I'm glad that I was told, I was going to be a lawyer, because this is what grandfather wanted me to do. I remember even in Bellevue, you had to write a paper on what you wanted to do, and it was all about law, you know, and you had the 3 little brass clips, and you'd open it up, and I'd written about that, and he helped me a great deal on that, I can tell you that. So he just said I was going to law school, and I'd planned to go to the University of Virginia, but it was the height of the Depression. I didn't have any money, and so I worked every summer in the bank, and also I had scholarships out at Southwestern, and then after that, I went on to the University of Virginia, and up there I was fortunate to get some scholarships, and I did some typing on an NYA job. That was one of the letter thing, National Youth Administration. And I took up tickets at the football games and got people to live in various houses and get them to eat in various dining places. So I was able to get through very
Well, when you were at Southwestern, what type of study habits did you have?
I had, after my first year, excellent study. To me, going to college was something like a whole new life. I was just so excited about going to college. I never will forget it, because I remember when I brought home my first report card, my grandfather was expecting all A's, and he looked at it. He always at night was studying his Greek, or reading Greek or Latin, and he didn't say anything. I said, "What do you think about it? What do you think about it?" "You can do better." And that's the only thing he said. So I picked up and did well after that. But to begin with, I just thought fraternity life and being engaged in all the activities of the college was something wonderful. And I loved Southwestern, and I've kept active in it. And I think, as you might know, I served on the board out there for 14 years, 12 as secretary. So I got to know a lot about the college and the presidents and the like. And
Well, you were president of the Alumni Association at Southwestern, which is now called Rhodes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Board of Trustees.
That's right.
Distinguished Alumni Award. So you've kept very active with Rhodes College.
They've been very nice. Yeah.
Didn't you also receive the Distinguished Service Medal from Rhodes College?
I did.
I think you have received just about everything anybody could receive from
Well,
it's
a great institution. And Dr. Rhodes, for whom they named the college, I worked for him. I had a scholarship, but I thought I ought to do something for it, so I was his secretary, and he was head of the physics department. I didn't know one atom from another, and I type out all these things. And then they asked him to lend his name to the college, because they had constant confusion on Southwestern. I remember I was handing a U.S. estate tax return, and an agent from Nashville called me one time, because there were a lot of charities listed, and one of them was Southwestern at Memphis. And this agent called me and said, "What is it?" He didn't know whether it was a riding academy or whether or not it was a baseball team or what it was. And I said, "Let me just patch you into an agent here and let him explain it to you." So that was one reason they changed it, because of the great confusion. And I was somewhat instrumental in encouraging Dr. Rhodes, who didn't want to do it. And I remember in his acceptance speech, he said, "I hope I haven't hurt the college too much by allowing you all to use my name."
In 1993, you received an honorary degree from Rhodes College, Doctor of Laws.
That's correct.
From Rhodes College,
Right.
which is one of 4 honorary degrees that you hold. Is that right?
People have been nice, yes.
And you got a Bachelor of Arts from Rhodes, what year, do you recall?
From Rhodes was 1939.
And then you decided to go to law school.
Correct.
Why did you choose the University of Virginia?
Well, as I kind of early indicated, I didn't have any choice. That was determined by my grandfather, I guess, the moment I was born, and I was so happy that I did go there. And of course, excellent law school and excellent training, and I remember one thing, talking about what you did. I made my decision not to get active. I'd been active in the fraternity life at Rhodes. I've been privileged to be the eminent archon of the president, and I wouldn't even get active up there. And I remember, you can see this halo right here, the whole first year up there, I had one date, and that was to go down to Randolph-Macon for a Valentine event, going down all dressed up in the tuck with galoshes on. It was in the snow, so I worked pretty hard up there and enjoyed it.
So you didn't have as many activities at the University of Virginia Law School as you did at Southwestern, is that right?
No, my whole activity there was, really, I had several jobs, but I worked, I was fortunate to have a good record, and I was on the law review, and did the law review work and so on.
Well, you were also a member of Omicron Delta Kappa fraternity.
Correct.
Phi Delta Phi.
Right.
Graduated Order of the Court.
Right.
And you were the editor of the Virginia section of the Virginia Law Review.
That's correct.
So, by most people's standards, you were very active in law school.
I think that might be a fair assessment, yes.
And in 1979, if I recall correctly, you were inducted at the University of Virginia into Phi Beta Kappa.
That's correct.
Sounds like a pretty active schedule, even if you say it wasn't all that active.
Well, I was busy. And one other thing that I had, which made it nice, I was a dormitory counselor the last year, and therefore I was able to get all my laundry and cleaning done, and take care of the dormitory. And the year before, I'd gotten people to go to a particular rooming house, and was able to get my room taken care of there. And then, as I pointed out, I got people to eat at a particular rooming house and got my meals.
Tell us how you assess the value of the law school curriculum that you had at University of Virginia Law School.
I think it was excellent because they made you think, and they were always, I remember one of the first days that I was there was a guy named Leslie Buckler who was teaching us torts, and he had been a big litigator in a Wall Street law firm, and he had called on someone to recite, and I thought, well, boy, that's a pretty good answer that guy gave. And then Buckler would take issue with him. And then I think, well, Buckler was right. And then Buckler would shift on to something else. So he was just always telling you how you had to analyze and make a full assessment of the facts and the law that was applicable. I thought it was very, very fine courses.
How long did it take you to graduate from law school?
It was the 3 years, as I pointed out. I had this opportunity to go into the Navy. Did I mention that to you? The fact that I had an eye problem and I couldn't get into the Navy because I couldn't pass a physical. And one of my buddies who was up there ahead of me wanted me to be a yeoman because he said I knew shorthand and typing and so forth.
What's a yeoman for those
The yeoman is one of the lowest ranks in the Navy, but it means a secretary. And he wanted me to do all his typing and all his shorthand work because he knew. In fact, I remember one time someone borrowed some of my notes to study for exam and gave them back. Says, all in shorthand. I can't do anything with those notes.
Now, had you graduated from law school when you went into the Navy?
No. What happened was, fortunately, they allowed in Virginia to let you take the Virginia bar exam at the end of your second year instead of just the third year. And we had a cram session on courses that we hadn't had. And so I went down to Norfolk and took my typewriter and took the exam. And fortunately, I was able to pass that Virginia bar exam. And they gave me a Tennessee license by virtue of the Virginia license. And so I was continuing in my third year, and a very close friend of mine who was later in our wedding, called me from Washington and said he was in the Office of Naval Intelligence, and he had a commission, but there was another fellow up there who had an eye problem and had been there for 6 months, and at the end of the 6 months they gave him a waiver, and that there was one opening there, and if I could come up there I could become a civilian in the Office of Naval Intelligence. So I asked Dean Ribble, and I'd been an assistant to the dean. He said, sure, Shep, you're going up. It's just a few little courses you have completed, and then come back in June and get your degree. So I went on up there and worked for 6 months and got my commission, and I did everything everybody else did. We were working to check out people who were supposed to be suspect, spies, and then also we did other checking to people who wanted to handle secret documents and the like. So that's how I got into the Navy.
1942 is the year that you entered the Navy.
Correct.
Did the war have anything to do with your interest in the military at that time?
I remember I was up in one of the rooms in Virginia. If you wanted to take an exam, you know, they let you go anywhere you want to, in your room or wherever. And I was up there either taking or studying, for example, and someone came in and the second floor room I was in and said, guess what? I said, what? Said, the Japs have just bombed Pearl Harbor. And so I, wanted to go into the service, and then I had an excellent, exciting, wonderful experience in the Navy.
You still hold the rank of 05 Commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve, is that right?
Correct.
Did you later stay in the reserves and do 20 years?
I can tell you, a military man. I got back, I'd had about 4 years, and I went every Monday night. I'd go to church on Sunday, Navy on Monday, church on Sunday. It was just a routine until I got another 16 years, and so I got my 20 in order to be, to have my retirement, yes.
So now you carry a gray card.
Yes, that's exactly correct.
And you're proud of that gray card.
I really am.
Huh?
I like it. I like
Go
it.
out to Millington and to the commissary.
Well, the thing is, I can't convince my wife that it's a saving to go out there 25 miles an hour, and I haven't been able to do much with her, because she says, why that? I say, you don't have to pay sales tax, and you get a lot of staples and so forth, and it'd be a good deal. But I'm going to work on her some more and see if I can get out there. But I might say I have gone out to the package store. They have some good deals out there, too.
The Class 6 store is very active out there.
That's correct.
The national government of the Republic of China gave you an award or medal during your service. Tell us about that.
When I got into the Navy, immediately I went to an intelligence school there in Washington, and then they sent me to an indoctrination school up at Hanover, at Dartmouth, and I enjoyed that. And then I came back, and then there was an advanced naval intelligence school up in the Henry Hancock Hotel, and a lot of interesting people. I remember Whizzer White was one of them in the class, and one of the Vanderbilts with entourage of nurses and so forth with the children there. And I'd had some good contacts in the Navy Bureau of Personnel, and I said, I want to get, you say you can't put me on a ship because of my eyeglasses, but I want you to give me overseas duty. Well, the next thing I knew, they said that we're sending you to San Juan in the 6th Naval District. That's not touching the continent, and you can get some experience there. So I was down there in intelligence, and then they sent me down to Curacao. And people might not know that Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, the 3 Dutch islands there, just north of South America, interesting spots. In that period of time, the oil was down in the Sea of Maracaibo, and they had these Dutch shallow tankers that would bring the unrefined oil to either Aruba, where it was Esso, or to Curacao, where it was Royal Dutch Shell, and they would refine the oil there. And they had the largest refineries, any place that I understand, in the world at that time, except Baku, Persia. You know, the Navy and the Army and the whole military travel on the oil and gas. It's so important. At the beginning of the war, German subs came in there, and one night sunk 14 tankers. So they decided to build up a military support there, and they had the PV Venturas that go over and scout the whole Caribbean. they would have DDs, destroyers, or DE destroyer escorts, and other boats that would, other ships that would go with these convoys. There would be GAT, Guantanamo, Aruba, Trinidad, and then they'd go to Recife at the beginning of the war, where the African engagement was. And then after the African engagement was over, they went up to Londonderry to take the military supplies and oils up there. And sometimes they'd have tankers, maybe a convoy of 150 large, huge tankers. So I was the operational intelligence officer down there in that joint command of British, Dutch, and American. And I would board every ship that came in to find out what sub-sightings they'd had or radar contacts they'd had, and also to brief every ship, that Navy ship that went out. Usually they'd go out till 4 or 5 o'clock early in the morning in the dark, and I'd brief them about whether a friendly sub was in the area coming back to New Haven, Connecticut, or whether a neutral would be coming along latitude 15 all lighted up. So this is what I did down there, and lived at a place called Camp Pereira. And the whole time, Paul, I was down there, I think I was down there almost 18 months, 13 months before I got some leave, and it rained one time. And so you can appreciate rain sometimes. We wore these little white hats, either caps, one with the bill, white shirts, and white shorts, white socks, white shoes. That was the uniform for the whole time we were down there.
Well, we can tell that you're proud of your military service and your military career.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Before we go into your career as a lawyer, we will take a break. However, I'd like to ask one question before we break.
Okay.
Why did you decide to go to clerk for Judge John D. Martin out of the military?
I was in, now I want to tell you about my China experience sometime. When I got out, can I tell you a few?
Sure, go ahead.
What happened after I got to Curacao, I kept saying I wanted to go on a capital ship, thinking they didn't have to stand duty maybe, or go overseas. And I got my orders, you're going to China. So I got up there, and they called me in and said, well, we understand you don't want to go to China. I said, well, where'd you get that word? Well, one of my buddies, William Bimbo Worthington, was up there, and he heard that the last bunch they had to parachute into China. He didn't think that was good for me. So they said, look, it's voluntary. You don't want to go, you don't have to go. I said, oh, no, I want to go. So they sent me down to the sick bay in the dispensary, and they gave me every shot for cholera, everything in the world. They said, give him the works. So then I flew from Memphis, and it's an interesting story. I won't take all the time to tell you about when I got to Cairo on what happened there. But anyway, then I got to Calcutta, Chungking, and when I got to Calcutta, the Japs were pushing up in the underbelly up through Burma, so they would not take anybody else over the hump. It was a real problem because they had only so many flights, and they wanted to take military equipment if they could, rather than maybe personnel. So they put me in charge of a Camp Kanchapara, out from Calcutta, and I was commanding officer of that. Then they brought me in and said, well, we still aren't able to go. We thought we were. We're going to put you in charge of a motor pool. Amazing. First thing I did was give myself a motorcycle. I nearly got killed on that. And then next thing, I got a Jeep, and I almost got in trouble because I went to the ship store and came out and rode off in my Jeep, and lo and behold, I looked in the glove compartment, Paul, to find something I put in there, and I couldn't find it. I got back there, these MPs were all the way. I'd taken the general's Jeep, which was right ahead of my Jeep. And if I'd been an Army guy instead of a Navy guy, I probably wouldn't even be here today. I'd probably still be in prison. But anyway, finally I went over the hump, and they gave you two ways to go. Either they gave you CNAC, China National Aviation Corp, which went through the mountains, the Himalayas and so forth, or you give an ATC where you went over with oxygen. When I went from Memphis to Dinjan and then went through, and then they told me, said, you're going to land on a sandbar. Well, the only thing I could think about it was the sandbar Mud Island out here in Memphis. And you and I being pilots, we appreciate this. This guy came down and he put that plane down, his old DC-3 C-47, you know, and he put those wheels down and then put on the brakes at the other end of the sandbar, and they had a little bamboo shack where they checked you in, and they had these coolies in the sandbar. They were up, the Yangtze went down this way, they got you and poled you across, and then I had to climb up on maybe 100 to 200 stone steps in Chungking. Those guys kept passing me all the time. They had all my bags, and I was sitting down resting. And so I stayed there. And then the group I was with was called SACO, the initial letter, Sino-American Cooperative Organization. The plan was that the Army and the Navy would hedge hop across the Pacific and then land on the China coast before going into Japan. This was before the bomb. And they had a guy who was an old China hand named Admiral Milton Miles, M-I-L-E-S, and there was a Broadway actress called Mary Miles, so they called him Mary Miles. And they had an agreement between the Chinese, and that was signed by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and T.V. Soong, and signed by the Americans. That was Frank Knox and President Roosevelt. And the idea, as Miles said, they told him, just get out there and give the Japs hell until we can get out there. So this group was made up of Army, Navy, some French, and some Marines. And we had these camps all over China. I was in the headquarters camp. I started off in intelligence and ended up being the operations officer. And we lived in these little bamboo mud thatched houses and ate Chinese food with chopstick. I remember the first night I said, how do you use these things? They said, you get pretty good, and when you get a peanut and throw it up in there and catch it, we'll know that you know how to use them. And so, and drank a lot of rice wine. I could tell you stories about that, Gombe, and then they had a Mai Tai drink. One of the enlisted man would put it in his mouth and light a match to it. It was that potent. But I stayed out there, and the idea was we worked with the Chinese, and they had the Chinese American, like S1 Chinese, S1 American, S2 Chinese, S2 American. And my counterpart was General Yi Wei, and I sat across the table like you and I, and Victor Liu, our interpreter, would sit right here. And we'd have a staff meeting usually every morning. And the idea was to train the Chinese in guerrilla warfare and to gather intelligence and, to rescue the downed aviators. Like Doolittle's group came over there, and they had all the fields laid out with torches as to where they would go. And I was told that one guy didn't light his torches, and they executed him because these people had no way to land. Then they had all these scout and radar guys come from Fort Pierce, Florida, getting ready. And then they had so many guys who came out there who were beach masters. I never will forget a guy named Halprin. He got one at North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy. And I said, gee, I'm so impressed. He said, Chef, you shouldn't be. He said, they give you one and they put you on the mailing list, and when they got some others, they just send you out another Navy Cross. But the plan was to do that. And we had these camps all over. Some of them were up there right in the Gobi Desert. One of them was right in the lights of Shanghai, and then Wuzhou, Amoy, Canton, all over China. And that's what they were trying to do.
Why was it important to you to have a letter from Judge Martin prior to you becoming his law clerk?
Well, after the bomb, they moved everybody in the staff up to Shanghai. I remember I was in the Cafe Hotel, which was the hotel, and I also remember all the radiators had been cut off down at the floor because the Japs had taken all the metal, and it got kind of cold in there. But after we were there, we all wanted to come home. I mean, I went up one time to Beijing, Peking, on an R&R, and had a wonderful experience there. But we wanted to go home, and they said, you can't get home without having a letter showing you got a job waiting for you. So, of course, I wrote Judge Martin, who had offered me the position when I was to be graduated from Virginia, and he said, Chef, they'll be waiting for you when you get back. So I told him I need some help. So he wrote me a letter, I never will forget, saying that your clerkship is waiting for you, and this will furnish you an excellent refresher following your enforced inert interim since graduation from the law school.
Judge John D. Martin was what type of judge?
He was a member of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th Judicial Circuit, and at that time they just had 6 judges on that court. And of course they'd meet there. Say our first meeting up there was March, and then he'd hear the cases, and the clerks would sit in there, and then we would you know, do work for him, and then he'd come back and write the opinions across the street at the federal building, and then they'd go back up and have some more hearings because there's Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee is in the Sixth Circuit.
Was this in Cincinnati or in Memphis?
This is in Cincinnati. The hearings are all in Cincinnati, and
this is where you worked?
Where we what happened is Judge was a great lover of horses, and many times we go by Louisville or go by Lexington en route and see the horses and so forth. And then it was an interesting experience. The judge would say, all right, son, it looks like we get up there on a Sunday. He'd say, looks like I'm sitting Monday, and these are the cases that are coming up, and look at them. So I, just like in law school pretty much, go through them and recite to him. He'd say, well, mark this, and what does the appellate say, and what does the record say, and I'd mark them, and then the judges would be in there on those cases, and the law clerks, they call us the faculty. We also have a desk right below the judges, and we would meet at lunchtime, and the judges would meet at lunchtime, and then the judge would come back and say, son, what about that first case? And we'd give, I'd give an opinion as to what we thought. And Paul, I might say, when you aren't an advocate, sometimes things are very clear.
Let's take a break before we go into your career as a lawyer.
All right.
Shep, you've been a lawyer for 52 years, plus or minus a few months. Is that right?
I think that's correct.
And you practiced law in West Tennessee, specifically Memphis, all your career.
That's correct.
Tell us about...
I had just a little bit of experience in the Navy and a couple of court-martials, but that's the only experience I had outside of practice in Memphis.
Now, that was back when they appointed trial and defense counsel, even if you weren't a lawyer.
That's right, that's right.
Tell us about your first job search, and also tell us what your beginning salary was.
Well, when I was with the judge, young John Martin, I say young because he was so young, even going into school and at the University of Virginia and the like, was back from the Navy, and he had been on the destroyer, and his practice had been pretty much carried on for him during that period of time by Mr. Sam Costin and John Costin. So John was looking for someone to start with him, and I had opportunity elsewhere too, and I decided to go with John. My buddies at the University of Virginia always wanted me to go to New York. If you wanted a law review in those days, you went up to visit the law firms instead of law firms come to see you. And one of my good friends said, good gracious, he'd been working on a particular case for 2 years back in a Carroll on one little point. And I said, you probably can't get a guy out of jail in the middle of the night either, can you? He said, no, I haven't seen any clients. Well, they said, well, why don't you come up here and rub off the green edges? And I talked to Memphis attorneys. They said, we'd rather you not go to New York and get that high salary and work on one particular little thing and not have the experience of being with clients and doing the little court work. And so I agreed that that was not the thing to do. So John offered me, which was the best offer I had, of $200 plus 10% of our net profits. And immodestly, I can say, other than a couple of fellows who were in the real estate practice, I think I probably made, to begin with, as much or more than any young lawyer, because John had a wonderful practice. One of his big clients was Ed Crump. He was not only, quote, Boss Crump's attorney, but a cousin of his. And I might say, for the record, they had a splendid, wonderful organization, E.H. Crump and Company, and Southern American Insurance Company. So John had a good base to begin with, and he was a tremendous litigator, and he'd gotten some good judgments before. And I might say in digression that I've been privileged to meet a lot of lawyers in a lot of cities and a lot of countries, and he had the keenest legal mind I think I ever ran across. I mean, we'd be having plans to go to lunch one day, and he was waiting and said, where were you? I said, so-and-so called and had this problem. He said, what's that? I said, I don't know. He says, let's go look. I said, John, come on, I want to go. No, we got to go and look it up. And so he would put that top priority, no matter how old he was. He wasn't going to let any youngster, anybody else be ahead of him. So I started off with John, and he kept telling me anything I can do to take something off of him, then he could do something of greater importance. So I spent a lot of time down in General Sessions Court, and from time to time, you know, would sit as a special judge down there. And right then and there, they had a lot of OPA work and evictions, and we were always serving evictions, represented a lot of people who had properties and the like. So then I did some of the probate work and did some of the chancery work, and he did the heavy litigation, and I would help him as a young fledgling in doing that work. And I can tell you my first case that you'd be interested in maybe. We represented an outfit called Gilsa Farms. And Gilsa Farms had sold a mule to a guy named Ryan, who was a milk inspector, R-Y-A-N. And he wouldn't pay the note. So John said, okay, you go ahead and take over this case. And I went down there, and it was in General Sessions Court. And Judge R.I. Moore, I put on my proof, but here the note was, and hadn't paid for it. And Mr. Kincannon, Brother Kincannon, an older gentleman, and he said, well, there's a failure of consideration, that mule was blind. And so I didn't know exactly maybe how best to handle that, so the judge took over. I never will forget, said, now, Brother Kincannon, said, you know how you buy a mule, you go all around him, and you pat him, you open up his mouth and look at his teeth. And I don't know if that mule was blind or not, but if he was blind, your client should have known he was blind. I'm going to give Mr. Tate a judgment on that note. And I appreciated all his help. And then I very timidly said, now, Judge, there was a provision in there for reasonable attorney's fee. And he said, okay, I'm going to give you $25. And Brother Kincannon spoke up and said, Judge, that's not going to help him much. As soon as this case is over, he's getting in a car. I remember it was February and snowing on the ground. He's going up to Cincinnati to get married. So I remember that first case quite well.
So your first case, you made a $25 fee.
That's right, $25 fee.
Were there partners? I assume that there were some partners. How many were there in the law firm that you went to work
when I started off, I had worked the summers, I said, in the Union Planners Bank Trust Department. That was on the 4th floor. Bertrand W. Kahn, who was a fine Harvard Law School graduate and just a fine person, but he had a lot of interest, like he was president of Marks and Bensdorf and Home Federal Savings and Loan. He had an office with a secretary, Ordell Hughes, and another office next. So he allowed us to be there, and you had to go through my office. I had a little desk, and open a door to get into John's office. In other words, you come in here and pass by me and go in. And so John and I were there, and then later we formed this partnership, and it was John D. Martin and then and Shep Tate were partners, and also Bert Kahn was with us, and then later came Martin and Tate and down the line.
So actually you were, although the gentleman that you were referring to was your mentor, you never were an associate.
Well, I started off as well, I guess, I don't know how you describe it. I started off with a share of the income based on our production, right, on our net.
You got a salary, but you also
I got $200 plus 10% of the net, right.
And then shortly thereafter, you became a partner.
Yeah. And John Martin, and this has been written up by one of John's good clients was Kemmons Wilson. We did Kemmons Wilson, Wallace Johnson, a lot of builders and the like, and I was always drawing mortgage documents out of my ears constantly. In fact, so much so, I taught, I think, for 10 or 11 years at the Southern School of Banking on legal aspects of mortgage lending. I wouldn't try to draw a deed of trust, I'm sure, today, but anyway. And one thing, talking about money, John drew the first franchise agreement for Kemmons and Wallace, who were the Holiday Inn beginners. And we had 10% of the stock. And John was always worried about it, and one day he met with Kemmons and Wallace and expressed his concern because of the heavy notes that were outstanding. And we were working around the clock on Holiday Inn on problems all over the place. And they said, John, the insurance company's not going to call that note. And then John said, well, I'm worried about it. He said, well, would you want to get out? And he said, well, I really would. All right, what would you and Shep have charged for the work you've done thus far? And he said, well, $25,000. So they said, well, give us the stock back. And I had 10% of John's interest.
So this was what year? About?
Oh, good gracious. Gee, beginning of Holiday Inn. I've forgotten, Paul, how many years that was, but I was a a young fella in the office. I guess it might be in the 1940s or 50s at the most.
So let me see if I've got it straight.
Yeah.
You were talking about you sold back your 10% or your 5%
Yeah.
interest
Yeah.
in Holiday Inn.
And so Kimmons has written a book, and he has said this. In fact, one time I was leading a group of distinguished Memphis out to NORAD, and I was introducing all the people at the table to this Lieutenant General. And he said, now let me tell you about Shep Tate, Shep and John Martin. I said, Kimmons, don't tell that story again. He said, well, John's always raking me over. So later, Kimmons said that stock would be worth $14 million. And so John's share would have been $1.4 million, and mine would have been, John's share would be $14 million, and my share would have been $1.4 million. And my wife said I wouldn't be worth anything. I said, no, I'd have another boat or an airplane. But Kimmons is always holding that up to us that we didn't want to take the risk of staying with him on that.
What was a good salary for a successful lawyer back when you first started?
Oh, I imagine $2,000 or $3,000. I got $200.
$2,000 or $3,000 a month, a year, or what?
Yeah. I got mine was $200, and I'd been offered $200 by someone else, a very fine top law firm here.
$200 per
a month. And so
And-
212, that'd be $2,400. I said, and another dear friend of mine said that he would let me. I won't necessarily mention him. Said that he'd let me be in his office, a fine firm, and hang my coat there. And
Shep, I know you told us earlier that you did a little criminal practice when you were in the Navy, either as a prosecutor or a defense counsel. Did you do any criminal practice in civilian life here in Memphis?
Paul, I really didn't. The only thing I had, which is just on a low scale, is when a dear friend would call me with that one phone call from the jail saying that he or she had been charged with DUI, and could I get him or her out of jail. And I often did that. And then invariably when I would try to find any of the associates when I was a partner, nobody was ever around, and it was always at midnight, it seemed like, on a Saturday or Sunday. So basically that's been my criminal law practice.
So, but unlike your University of Virginia graduates that went on to the New York law firms, you do know how to get somebody out of jail.
I can do that, yeah.
Well, that's good. Tell us about your work habits on a day-to-day basis that I understand, in doing a little background check on you, have continued to this very day.
You know, it kind of upsets me. Recently, I was talking with my youngest daughter up there in Alexandria, Virginia, and she said, Dad, you work so much, we didn't see much of you. Said you always taking us to church on Sunday, and then you'd take us over to Angel Food Ice Cream to get us ice cream, and we had our good clothes on, and you always had a rule if we spilled ice cream on our clothes, you got to eat the rest of the ice cream cone. Said we remember that, and then you'd take us to the zoo, and we'd see all the animals, and you'd go back to the office on Sunday afternoon, and you always worked every Saturday. And we really put in the hours. I'm telling you, we just really put in the hours in those days. And my wife mentioned that too. She said, you know, when I came here, I didn't know anybody except the Gaylors, and I had this great big French poodle, and we lived in this little garage apartment, and you were gone so much of the time. And I sometimes tell the younger people now that they just don't realize the hours that people were putting in previous years.
Do you still put in those hours?
Yeah, I work every day. Don't work on Saturday unless there's something that comes up. I'm here every day.
What was the influence of the State Bar Association at the time you began practicing law?
I remember how I got first involved. I was put on a membership committee of the local bar, and then the next thing I knew, they put me up as a director, and I mentioned it to John. I said, John, that was nice of you to do that. And he said, John was very expressive sometimes. He said, hell, Shep, I had nothing to do with it. And Mr. Ed McCadden put you up with Armstrong McCadden Allen firm. And then I went through the chairs, and then they asked me to become president of the state bar, and I was honored and pleased to do so, because I think you can't beat the lawyers. And I worked hard on that, and I think as much on the local level and on the state level, we were trying to improve continuing education as much as anything at that time. And we had many seminars and the like. And I remember one of my friends, Charlie Crump, said, "I'm never going to accept a job again from you because you always get me something that I have to work real hard on." I think he did it locally and also on a state basis. So had a wonderful experience in both cases.
You were not only president of the Memphis and Shelby County Bar Association back in the late 50s and early 60s, but you also, as you alluded to a minute ago, were president of the Tennessee Bar Association.
Correct.
Was that that was 1996 to 97, is that right?
Tennessee Bar was 1963, 64.
1963
yeah.
to 64.
Yeah. The American Bar was 78, 79, yeah.
And then the American Bar Association presidency was
Yeah.
78, 79,
Yeah.
which we'll get into in just
Right,
a second.
right.
But since you brought him up, Charlie Crump is one of your dear friends.
Yeah.
And would it surprise you if Charlie Crump recently was quoted as saying that Shep Tate worked me so hard in all of the bar committee activities that I swore that I would disavow myself of any affiliation wherein Shep Tate is the president in the future?
He has said that. All right. That's a correct statement.
He said you worked him as hard as anybody could possibly work anybody.
I didn't mind working hard too, so I was getting him to work hard.
But he
Yeah.
has great respect for you, and he told me a lot about you. I also understand one more aside on Charlie Crump. You and he are sometimes confused as lookalikes, is that right?
That's correct.
And he told me, and we'll skip over to when you were president of the American Bar Association in 78 and 79, but as I understand it, the induction was in New York City
Correct.
at some fancy hotel, and they had a big program and all that, and that you were allowed to invite friends and relatives to come to the induction. And Charlie Crump told me that he almost got inducted as president of the American Bar Association Revenue. Tell us about that.
Well, the problem is, Charlie, you know, we have been active in the bar, active in scouting, active in the Episcopal Church. Both went to Southwestern Roads, both went to University of Virginia, and have been close friends. He's godfather, one of our children. And the only trouble that Charlie has given me is one time I had this client call me early in the morning. I called Charlie, and I said, "Charlie, did you park in the usual spot this morning?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Someone speak to you?" And he said, "Yeah." I didn't know who he was. I said, "That guy happens to be one of my best clients and just called me and bawled me out." Said I was rude to him. I said, "Just don't do that to me anymore." And so invariably, Charlie and I, people will call me on something. I said, "Don't you want Charlie Crump?" So several, like Dan Canale and Roan Waring, sometimes have been confused. And Charlie and I have often been confused because, I guess, of our...
Well, what happened up in New York when they were calling Shep Tate to come to the podium to be sworn in,
and Charlie was up there.
Crump was there.
Yeah, so
What
they said someone went to get Charlie to bring him up to take the oath. So this could happen.
But Charlie Crump told me yesterday on the telephone that if he'd have wanted to, he could have been sworn in as president of the ABA
That's
that day,
probably
because he
true.
looked like you.
That's true.
You were a hard worker, always have been a hard worker for the last 52 years as a lawyer. You have been president of the ABA, president of the TBA, president of the Memphis and Shelby County Bar Associations, and have been on chair of committees that are 4 or 5 pages in length, single-spaced. Have you had a chance to have any hobbies during all this 52 years of law practice that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, one of my hobbies has always been tennis. I played tennis out at Southwestern, way down on the ladder, and I was manager of the tennis team. And my dear mother, I remember when I came back from service, she said, "I've saved up some money, and I've gotten the money to give you to have a membership at the University Club because you play tennis." and I play tennis every week. I just played last week, played the week before. I love to play tennis. Usually my wife and I walk in the morning for about an hour, so that has been a constant hobby. I'm also a boater. I've boated a great deal all my life. I got a boat on Lake Michigan. My wife's doctor father had a place up there, and Jan's two brothers were MDs, so it was kind of a complex. One doctor brother on one side, one on the other, and Jan and I had the center cottage, and I have a boat here at the Memphis Yacht Club. And then the thing that gave me more pleasure, I think, than anything is a number of years ago, a few years ago, let's say, when I was 65, I took up flying because Shep was complaining to me that I was never getting up to Michigan in the summertime. I said, well, son, when you go to the Tennessee Bar and the Tennessee Bar Foundation and the Sixth Circuit Judicial Conference and the American Bar Association, I just can't be gone all summer. And he says, well, that's not the practice of law that you're doing back in the office, and that's not vacation. And I said, well, I can't get away all the time. He said, I'm going to take up flying. He never had been in a private plane, and I insisted he get an instrument rating, so he got his private license and an instrument rating, and I did the same thing. And then he got an interest in the plane, and we'd fly to the coast, we'd fly to Cincinnati, we'd fly over to Arkansas, to Gaston, and go to fishing over there, and we'd fly up to Michigan several times whenever we could do it, and had wonderful experiences.
What about the Boy Scouts?
The Boy Scouts always has meant so much to me. As you asked earlier, I've still got my Eagle Scout ring that my dear grandmother gave it to me when I was 13, and I have been fortunate to be on the council and president of the council for a couple of years, and I try to keep active, and I was not able to go over to camp very much, but anyway, I did as much as I could to keep active in the Boy Scouts, which is a fabulous organization.
You don't have to take it off. Let us see your ring, if you don't mind. And your mother gave you that when your grandmother gave you that when you were 13 years old.
Yeah, 13 years old.
I know you're very proud of that. You're also proud of the fact that you were the recipient of the Silver Beaver Award in '63 and the Distinguished Eagle Award in 1980 with the Boy Scouts.
That's correct.
Going back to your legal career, what lawyer influenced you the most in your 52 years as a legal practitioner?
Gee, that's a toughie.
I meant for it to be.
One, I guess it'd have to be in the Martin family. The judge was a great mentor and put me to work vigorously and diligently, and I enjoyed working with him. And John was such a bright guy, but a number of years back I became active in the senior lawyers division, and I started the mentor program, which we worked up a mentor program resource guide, and we've given it to the deans of all the ABA related law schools and all the presidents of all the local and state bars. And I was thinking back of mentors. John was a good student, but he always made me do things on my own. I remember from time to time I'd ask him something I thought was pretty simple that he could tell me, and I always remember, he said, hell, Shep, I don't know. You look it up. My father never told me anything. So he made me always go to the books and dig. And I guess that, and work, good gracious. They say John used to come back on a weekend sometime after being out at night, and he'd take the draperies off the wall and put them over him and go on a sofa and go to sleep and wake up and work again. So he was a tremendously hard worker. So I guess that was probably good for me.
Did you have involvement in local, state, or national politics?
You know, I have never done that. John's father was head of the state Democratic Party. John was head of the state Democratic Party. And we used to talk, and I said, John, I'm going to vote for whomever I want to. And he said, well, Shep, if you're planning to go through center and everybody else goes through or goes around right in, we all going to make a touchdown. I said, well, John, that's going to be all right, too. I'm going to vote for whomever I want to and whatever party I want to. And this is what I have done. I've done it from time to time by persons and yet by parties back and forth. So I have never held a political office.
So you consider yourself an independent?
Well, independent thinker, let's say that. I do what I want to. I do what I want to.
Has there been any major event that has occurred in your 52 years of law practice that changed your career, such as a war, or civil rights movement, or women's movement?
No, in the women's movement, I remember they asked me, I've been active in the Memphis Rotary Club, they asked me to do research as to whether or not the women should be admitted to the Rotary Club of Memphis, because there had been a big lawsuit nationally, and I researched it ahead of the committee and gave the opinion that I thought definitely they should. And as a result, Julia Smith Gibbons, who is a U.S. District Judge here, was the first person I sponsored, and then she became the first woman president of the Memphis Rotary Club. And I remember when I was president of the Rotary Club, I had an African American up at the head table every time as secretary, recognizing visiting Rotarians and guests and so forth. So I've tried to do my best on those matters of questions of diversity and the like.
While you're on the Rotary Club, you were a Paul Harris Fellow.
All right.
Explain that to us.
All I know is one day they said that they had an announcement to make, and they called me up there and said that they were awarding me a Paul Harris Fellow. And Paul Harris was the first president and the founder of Rotary up in Chicago. That's the #1 club, as they call it. And I think that's given to Rotarians that maybe have done some work in Rotary and live up to the Rotary ideals and maybe have done some community service and the like.
In your law firm, has the administration of the legal practice changed much in 52 years?
You know, a number of years ago, they started a committee in the ABA called the Lawyer Competence Committee, and Gene Thomas, who was president at that time, I had been president, asked me to head that up. And we had a fine committee, and we looked into skill and knowledge, administrative problems, and personal problems, and went around the country having regional meetings and national meetings on those topics. And I was amazed at how it was so necessary to do a better law practice and also to protect yourself from malpractice and so forth, to have better administrative skills and have people in the office who did that. And I know, and I happen to be the chair of our Trust and Estate Council, and we just try to dot I's and cross T's on drawing instruments that I might draw it, another lawyer reviews it, and a paralegal proofs it and so forth. So we all make mistakes, and we're trying to always prevent those so they won't do any harm to our clients and to our firm. So I think more and more administrative work is there. I remember John and I sometime, we had almost nothing along that line, and I'd say, John, we ought to get some fees out. And he'd say, okay, let's see, Shep. And so he would go down and say, well, we spent a lot of hours on this, but didn't really get a good, tremendous result. But on this other matter, where we had this damage suit, they got a lot of money, and there ought to be a better fee arrangement there. So he was pretty good at knowing how to handle it, and I was just a neophyte. I remember the first time I went to set a fee, I never will forget. I said, John, I don't want to be a hawk, and I don't want to be a fee splitter. He said, hell, Shep, I don't know how to do that. That's the hardest thing you'll find in the practice of law. You do the best you can. So certain things he would tell me he wasn't going to help me, but I had to do it myself. So I can see constantly we got a law office manager, we got a whole room there with all the computers, all the bookkeeping, with people in there taking care of the things, and we get, as all law firms, get the constant day-by-day records we have to keep, and it's all posted. And at the end of the month, you know each client, what you've done for that client, and how many hours you spent, and what the billing rate is, or what is some contingent fee. And it takes up a lot of the time of the law practice now.
So that's a little bit different from the first case that you had where you made $25
That's absolutely true.
Tell us about the law firm that exists today. How many lawyers are in the firm? How many partners? You're the senior partner.
I think we've got now about, I'd have to look at the thing, I think we got around 26 or 23 to 6, I forget. We've never been over 30. And I think we got 16 managing directors. We are a PC, professional corporation. I remember one of the first matters I had down in probate after doing that, the judge said, "Mr. Tate, will you approach the bench?" And I went there. He said, "What is that PC?" and so on. And I said, "That's professional corporation," and so forth. And he didn't know what that was, and I was explaining to him. So we have, maybe 6 associates, and then we have the summer associates. I think we have 5 this first month, and maybe, you know, they split the summers now, and then 5 or 6 the next month. And we find that most of the people we bring on come through our summer associate experience, or getting maybe someone who's been a clerk for one of the judges.
What type of legal business does your law firm handle?
We have a general practice overall. We do very little criminal work, except sometimes we do the white-collar matters. David Wade, who is American College of Trial Lawyers fellow, was in the Shelby County Attorney General's office, and Richard Carter, whom you met, is head of our litigation department section, do some of that work. But we do litigation, we do securities work, we do bankruptcy work, we do trust and estate, we do real estate, we do banking, we represent a bank, we do personal injuries, we do about everything in the, we don't do any patent work, we do some copyright and trademark. I've got a brother-in-law and his son who do patent work, who are very fine.
What is the formal name of your law firm?
It's
here
Martin, Tate, Mara, and Marston, PC.
Although you don't handle criminal work, if one of your good business clients calls you at midnight down at the jail, would you handle some criminal work in that area?
Well, I'd see about getting that client out of the jail that night, I can assure you that. And sometimes we have cases come in, and what we do, and we had one recently, which was a high profile, and we worked with a client and worked with another lawyer who was involved in it. Telling a story about name, I'll tell you a quickie.
Sure.
On my first bar association meeting was over at Lookout Mountain Hotel, and I went with John and his lovely wife Ann, and we got away real late, and we got there and had a hard time getting there, and John couldn't find his reservation. He thought it was his name, it wasn't. Then he said maybe it's Sam Costin, it wasn't. He said, well, try John Costin. He finally found it John Costin, and this exasperated law clerk, room clerk, finished it, and then Ann turned to him and said, what about Shep? And this law clerk, this room clerk looked up and said, did you bring the dog along too? So I've had some trouble with my name sometimes.
Now, when you and Mr. Martin first began law practice, and you were making $25 fees over mule cases,
Yeah.
I doubt very seriously you had retirement and pension plans and things of that nature.
Didn't at all.
Do you have that now?
Yes, we have a 401k plan, which is a profit-sharing plan in the firm, definitely.
Insurance programs?
Insurance
things of that nature?
programs and retirement insurance. And that the 401k plan, of course, covers everybody in the firm, employees as well.
Tell us about any future planning and business development, if any, with your law firm. Do you have any plans to go to other geographic areas?
You know, we've thought about that, and especially when someone, luckily through my ABA experience, will call me and say, Shep, we've got a person who wants to have you handle something up in Knoxville. And I have said this repeatedly. I said, you know, I'd be happy to handle it, but it's not going to be financially effective for that client to have me get on a plane or get on a car and go all the way up there. So I've usually referred that future client to somebody else. So we have not, we've had opportunities to merge, and we have never done so. And what the future holds out, since everything is getting bigger and bigger and bigger with more and more merging of corporations and banks and law firms, I really don't know.
Before we take a break, do you see any newly developing areas of practice that young lawyers particularly ought to look at?
Yeah, I think healthcare law is coming on very, very strong. That's one. And I think more and more lawyers now are getting also into mediation, but that wouldn't be necessarily a young guy. You really have to have some experience in order to be a mediator or an arbitrator. But I think that's a great field in the whole law practice, no question about that.
Do you think judges are eventually going to lose their jobs and we'll go to mediation and arbitration?
I put it this way, and you've asked me a very important question. I think the cost and delay of litigation is something that is quite bad. I know when I was privileged to be ABA president, I worked on alternate dispute resolution. That was way back yonder. And it is just taking over because people just don't want to wait and wait and wait and have the cost that litigation entails.
I'd like to expand on that last topic when we go into our next section on career overview and also community activities. Let's take a break
Okay.
and come right back.